Hello, Chris again. Let's go ahead and move on to learning how to do some actual modeling with tools. So I'm going to go ahead and delete my cube and my plane and the sphere. Let's use this cylinder, and I'm going to change the translate Z from 2 to 0 so it's back in the origin point. Alternatively, I could just delete all that stuff and then make a new cylinder. It would be the same thing. Let's start off by making a simple top hat. Pretty easy model to sort of get the gist of a couple tools. So firstly, let's get this object on top of the grid. We can do that by changing the translate Y. So I could either hold X and snap up one time, because I know that a polygon primitive, this is, if I look in the front view here, you'll see that the height is exactly 2 grid spaces, 2 grid units high. So I could hold X and drag it. So now I know that this bottom is resting directly there. So this will be the top of the hat, and this will be the bottom. Let's make a brim. So before we can make a brim, we have to understand a couple tools and a couple notions. And the first thing that we need to understand is rather than making another cylinder and scaling it and pushing it through, it would be more efficient in this case to pull out the cylinder or pull out the faces to make the brim from this existing piece of geometry. In order to do that, we need to use the Extrude Tool, and we need another edge to delineate the thickness of the brim. Let's start by getting that edge. So this first tool that I'm going to show you is called the Multicut Tool. It can be found in several places. If I move my mouse up here, you'll see this icon. It looks like an X-Acto knife. And if I hover over it, it says Multicut Tool. Tools to cut, slice, and insert edges on polygons. In the modeling toolkit, a lot of the tools that we use are over here. So I'll frequently use both this top shelf and the modeling toolkit. And here's the Multicut Tool. The shortcut to the Multicut Tool, which is worth knowing, is Control, Shift, and then X. And that will give you the Multicut Tool. Once it is activated, you'll notice that the cursor turns into that little X-Acto knife. And as you hover over the object, it'll start to look like this, right? Where you'll get this sort of magnetization from one vert to another. And the basic function of this is to draw extra edges on the model, okay? So you do something like that. I'm going to undo that by hitting Z. So let's practice by just triangulating one quad. To do that, hover over a vertex, click, and then come down to the diagonal vertex across and click again. Now we see a preview of what that edge will look like once we complete the cut. To complete the cut, right-click on the mouse. Now you see we have this extra edge coming across. So that's one thing that the Multicut Tool can do. Another thing it can do is add an edge loop, and that's what we want to use it for right now. So if you hold the Control button down, you'll see that we can get a preview of an edge loop. And if we hover over one of these edges, we can determine where we want to drop this edge loop. So I'm going to come down here to the thickness that I want for the brim of the hat and then click once. Now we have this edge loop near the bottom. So we've just added and increased the amount of components that we have. So now I have a face loop that runs all the way across here. I selected it in that same fashion we learned the last video by clicking on one face, holding Shift, and double clicking on the other. And then we have these up here, right? So this has been split. We will be learning more about the Multicut tool later and some of its properties. The next tool that we're going to learn is the Extrusion Tool. To demonstrate the Extrusion Tool, I'm going to make a cube, and I'm just going to move it over here. You do not have to follow along with this part. I just want to show you a couple things about the Extrusion Tool. So you can extrude either faces or edges. Frequently, I am extruding faces more often than edges. So if I select a face, at that point, I can extrude it. I can also extrude more than one face. Let's start with one. I'm going to hit the extrude button, or I can hit Control E. For now, I'll hit the extrude button. Once I hit extrude, you'll see a couple things happen. I get this sort of unique looking widget, and then I also have this Poly Extrude Face 1 window with a bunch of options. When you extrude, all the border edges of your selection receive new faces attached to them, and this allows you to pull the original face or the original edge out. Now you can see that I have extra faces along the border edges of that original face selection. I'm going to undo this extrusion. Let's see what happens when I extrude more than one face. Hit Control E to extrude, and now I'm going to pull the this thickness word. I'm going to click and drag on it to increase the thickness of that extrusion. You'll see that I get a bunch of extra faces as anticipated, and by default this edge here is not receiving an extra face, and that's because this keep faces together is turned on. Most of the time you do want this to be turned on. If I were to turn it off, it will not only add faces to border edges, it will add faces to all edges that are in the selection. I'm going to turn this back on by clicking and dragging. Let's do another extrusion. So I'm going to select this face, and I'll hit Control E again. We've already explored thickness, and thickness is just going to push out or pull in a face or whatever, or an edge, whatever you extruded, and add faces to the border edges, right? And it's going to pull it out along the normals for that particular selection. So let me undo that. Local, if I extrude this and say local translate Z, it is going to average out the angle between the two selections. So you can see if I'm using local translate Z, you can kind of see the effect it's having here. If I change this back to 0, and instead I just use thickness, you'll see that it's going out at an even distance across. In this window, there's this little circle here that's partially filled up. This is the sensitivity of when you click and drag. So if this is up pretty high and I click, I'm dragging very subtly, and it's making really huge increments. If I turn this way down, you can see it's going to be a lot more sensitive. I can also hold Control and Shift to be very precise and subtle while clicking and dragging. Alright, let's extrude this face. Control E. Offset will do something like this. It will shrink or grow the extruded face, but it will not pull it out away from the other face or push it in. This is very useful. So let's extrude this face. I'm going to extrude it, pull it out, and then I'm going to add divisions by clicking and dragging on the word divisions, or I could type in the number of divisions. Notice that it is adding edge loops along the newly created faces. This can be very helpful as well. Alright, some tips in terms of using the extrusion properly. The first tip is, let's say I want to extrude these faces, and I start making extrusion, and I decide, oh hey, I actually don't want this extrusion, so I'm going to undo, and then I'll click off. The problem with what I just did is that I undid the movement, the thickness adjustment, but I did not actually undo the extrusion. And because of that, those faces still exist. They're just very small. And this is poor geometry and will create problems for you in the future with your model. So as you can see, if I select this edge and move it, there's another edge right there, right? It's just not visible. Most of the time, if you are modeling and you see this problem occurring where you have edges or vertices stacked on top of each other, it's because there was an extrusion made either by accident or on purpose, and there was no adjustment made to that extrusion. So I just undid all of that. So if you are going to extrude and you try adjusting it and you decide, you know what, that's actually not working for what I want, you need to undo all the way past the extrusion. And then you could, if you're not sure, you could always double check by selecting one of the border edges and moving it and making sure there's no extra edges. So now that we know that, I'm going to go to object mode and delete this. Go back to our top hat in progress, go to face mode. I'm going to select all these faces, and then I will extrude, Control E. Thickness, I'm going to pull this thickness out, like this. So you get something like that. Next, I want to select all of these faces down here. There's a lot of ways we can do this, as discussed in the previous video, but I'm just going to hold Tab and click and drag to paint. So I want there to be thickness to this. I'm going to hit 4 so I can see the wireframe of my top hat. I'm going to hit Control E. And then the first thing I want to do, if I pull this straight up, like this, let me hit 5, you'll see I'm getting this sort of black flicker. And that's because I have created new edges, but I have not shrunk in these faces. So there's no thickness to the height of this top hat. And there are faces that are trying to share the same screen space, and that is why we're getting the flicker. Faces by default are only one-sided. Okay, so you can see if I delete all those faces and I have a bunch of black faces here, I know that, oh, this is the back side of some polygons. Oh, there are the front side. You know, there's the front side. So I'm going to undo that. So with this extrusion, I'm going to offset it first to the thickness that I want. And now that it's offset, I'm going to extrude again by hitting Control E. I'll hit 4. And then I'll, pull this up to the height that I want. Something like that. I can hit 5 to go back to shaded mode. So now we have a bit of a top hat. Let's look at the next tool. The next tool is called Bevel. So bevels work with edges. You could select a face and it would bevel all edges that that face shares. But the primary purpose of a bevel is to, you can do a lot of things with bevels, but the primary purpose is to bevel or get rid of really harsh edges. 90-degree edges don't really exist in the real world. Sometimes you might come across an edge that looks like it's perfectly 90 degrees, but there are always little imperfections. Avoiding 90-degree edges in our models will help make them look more believable, add character to them, and just make them more interesting in general. So to bevel, first I want to select this entire edge loop. I'm in edge mode. I'm going to click on this, double click on this edge, and it will select the entire edge loop. Next, you can see here's the bevel tool. It's also up here. Looks like a cube that has beveled sides, or beveled edges. So I'm going to click on bevel, and we'll get another window, and you'll see immediately that that edge has been beveled by like 45 degrees. So 0.5, that was at 90 degrees. 0.5 of 90 degrees is 45 degrees. That's why we're getting this angle. These black faces here are the interior faces that we pulled up, and now we're seeing the inside of them. So I can click and drag on this word fraction to increase or decrease the distance between the two new edges, the split edges. And this will change their angle. And then if I add segments, I can start to round out that edge. So I'm going to do 0.1 and 3 segments. Seems good for now. This interior edge, I'm going to bevel this as well. And let's try the same thing. Let's try 0.1, and I'll bring segments up to 3. I'm going to double click on this edge, hold shift and double click on that edge. And I will bevel again. I'm going to leave it at 0.5 and bring this up to 2. And then I'll take this interior edge here, bevel that, and bring segments up to 3. And now we've made our first top hat. If you are in our first model. If you wanted to continue this, you could do things like you could add a silly like pilgrim belt and buckle to it by using the Multicut tool, dropping an edge loop there. I could select these faces and extrude them out like so. And I could start to model out a little belt for it to go on the top. Okay, we just went over the Multicut tool, extrusion tool, and the bevel tool. I'm going to save my work. So I go File, Save Scene As, and I'm going to name this Top Hat. And now I have this model to work on later if I want it. And that is all. We'll see you in the next video.